Is it meaningful legislation or just election year drama? We're breaking down the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. I'm Sarah, and with me as always is Stephen. Today, we're diving into a bill that's causing quite a stir as we inch closer and closer to Election Day, the Violence Against Women by Illegal Aliens Act. Welcome, Stephen.
Hello. Good to be here, as always.
So, before we dive into everything, I think it is very useful for us to just kind of talk about the general landscape right now in the States.
Yeah.
And something I've really been noticing this year is there's just been a ton of bills that are like kind of inflammatory and written in ways that are kind of meant to provoke, I don't know, like being afraid and those kinds of things about general immigrant sentiment. And I think that part of that is definitely a symptom of the fact that we are in an election year and this anti-immigrant, that immigrants are kind of coming, taking over, really dangerous, is something that is really being pushed by the right during this election season. Yep. But also, we do have a lot of people thinking about immigration, even in Colorado. Like, we're having a lot more immigrants kind of in the public eye. We've had like pretty big influx of people from Venezuela here. Mm-hmm. And, you know, it's definitely a pervasive thing in our society here right now.
It's true. And it's not just this country, of course. It's all around the world. Immigration is becoming sort of a hot topic, really, in a lot of countries. And you can look at some countries that have been quite permissive. I mean, Germany's a really good example here, where a few years back they said they were going to take 1 million migrants, and they were very welcoming to migrants. And there's been a huge backlash against it, and particularly in their elections. Obviously, they've lurched greatly towards the right, and you've got like what are frankly neo-Nazi parties getting elected, and it is basically all about immigration. Sweden's the same. Sweden is like the most welcoming country you can imagine, and they took huge numbers of immigrants, and now their politics again have lurched to the right, and there's a big backlash against attempting to integrate quite so many people. So it is a big problem all over the world, really. But in the US in particular, obviously, it's been highly politicized. Even more so, I would say, than in other countries, though it is the sort of topic that does tend to get politicized. But it is true that there are a lot more immigrants coming into the US than there used to be, and that's just a simple fact. And it's also true that many of the cities that they end up, many of the states on those front lines are really, really struggling to cope with those influxes, and that's causing lots and lots of social issues and so on. So even though it's politicized, there is definitely an issue there.
Yeah, and I was even listening to something that Trump was saying at a campaign rally the other week, and he was saying that he was going to get rid of all sanctuary cities from some law that's like from the 1800s or something like that, like a really old thing. And so, you know, and that obviously got quite a stir at the rally. And I think it's just it's really interesting to kind of see how it's being talked about in the election cycle, in the zeitgeist, in the news. And I was wondering, is there any kind of studies or anything like that just kind of showing the dangers or how things are actually existing in our society? Because something I hear a lot is that crime is down all over the place, but we feel like it's up because that's what the news is reporting on. And when these immigrant stories happen, there obviously are happening. They're being covered because they're, you know, true things that have happened, but it's not quite to the extent that people are feeling, and it's a little bit more of this kind of fear mongering thing.
Well, yes, there has, and in fact, this is one of the most studied areas of social science that you can imagine, really. There are a vast array of different types of studies, and it's largely because there's a lot of data about it, because it's to do with immigration and people coming in, and everyone fills out paperwork, and that generates data that can then be analyzed. So, I mean, there's a number of issues here. We could have a debate for hours and hours about whether immigration, broadly speaking, is a good thing or a bad thing. Does it help the country? Does it hinder the country? Are immigrants themselves good people or bad people? What about the legality of it? Is there such a thing as an illegal immigrant? So all of those kind of things. But one of the big issues in the US recently that's rather unpleasant is about the fact that immigrants are criminals.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the rhetoric of Donald Trump and a lot of others as well have suggested that immigrants coming in are all murderers and rapists and drug dealers and gang members and so on, and that they're coming in and wreaking havoc across the US. But as you say, crime has been falling, even though perception of crime hasn't been falling. Actual crime has been falling and has been falling for a long time now. The US is far safer in terms of crime than it's been for many decades. And people say that yes, fine, but then all these immigrants coming in, that's making it worse. It's upticking again, but it just
Mm-hmm.
isn't. There's no evidence to back this up. Now, data on this is difficult to come by, largely because you're talking about people who are by necessity undocumented, and therefore there isn't a lot of data on them because they're
Mm-hmm.
undocumented. But there are some studies looking at this, and Texas is actually a state that does have data on this. One of the few states that has actually quite robust data on this. So there's been a number of studies done. There was one that I read in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, PNAS, and they looked at Texas data from 2020. And what they found actually is that undocumented immigrants have substantially lower crime rates than native-born citizens and legal immigrants across a range of different felony offences. So, for example, US-born citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes, 2.5 times more likely to be arrested for drug crimes, and over 4 times more likely to be arrested for property crime. Other researchers looked at this, looked at the same data set, and looked at other different data sets as well, and broadly speaking, backs it up. So there's a few studies that are a bit suspect that show that criminals commit more crime. So, for example, and there's one in a different state where they looked at prison populations and so on, but then they used some rather sort of unreliable ways of describing what an immigrant is. Because obviously, one of the problems with this data is actually saying, what do you mean when you say an immigrant? There's all sorts of different
Mm-hmm.
definitions of what we mean by like an illegal or an undocumented immigrant as well. So, but broadly speaking, when you look at the data, there's no evidence to suggest that immigrants are committing more crimes than native-born Americans, and in fact, it's quite likely to be the opposite, that they commit fewer crimes. The bills that we're going to look at is talking about trying to prevent these crimes. Now, of course, the important thing here is to say that that doesn't mean that immigrants don't commit crimes. Of course, they do.
Mm-hmm.
Because you get any group of people, and you're going to have some people in there committing crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact is that they do not commit crimes at a greater rate than other different communities.
Yeah. Yeah. I think also one of I have a cousin that's pretty afraid about the immigrant situation and posting a lot about it. And I think
Yeah.
that from what I can glean from what he talks about is he doesn't even care, like, one crime is too much because they shouldn't be here. And so if they weren't here, it wouldn't happen. And, these
Yeah.
kinds of things. And I think
That's right.
that's something that's, a little bit harder to argue with if, like, it's
It
not
is.
as bad as we're making it seem like it is. But then,
Yeah.
there's a take of,
Yeah.
well, they shouldn't be here anyways.
Exactly.
And,
They
even one
shouldn't
is
be.
too much. So,
But then you can, yeah. So undocumented immigrants is a particular issue, but you need to look at also the positives, and then
hmm
say overall, are immigrants a net benefit to society or not? And generally speaking, again, if you look at the facts, you have to conclude that they are, because largely because populations are aging, birth rates are falling. All over the world, countries are suffering because birth rates are falling, populations are aging, and so there aren't enough people of working age within the population to actually do all the jobs that need doing and pay the taxes to support everything else. And the
hmm
reason why the US and other sort of Western democracies aren't suffering as much as countries like Japan, South Korea because of this is because of immigration. And so immigrants come in and are often young people. They'll often have more children, and they will mask those problems to the population and make it more likely that over time we'll have a soft landing when it comes to that. So we'll have enough people to actually work and pay taxes and so on. And they do the jobs basically that other people don't want to do. Most people
hmm
don't want to be, picking vegetables in fields in the hot sun and so on. And the kind of jobs they do, they're happy to do. They're happy to come over here and do them. People who employ them are happy to employ them and have them working in those jobs as well.
hmm
But
hmm
you can't dismiss the problems that people feel that like the society's changing, the nature of what it means to be an American is changing. Well, yeah, it's true, but hasn't that always been the case?
I remember learning a song when I learned about what a bill was, about how America's a melting pot when I was a child. So
that's where America is different from other countries, because other countries don't claim to be melting pots. It's like in Britain, we don't say, yes, we accept anyone. We've never been like that, right? And most countries haven't, but America has. America has always been this country that says, send us your dispossessed, your poor, and so on. So it's a bit rich now to be saying, well, let's forget about that. Scrub it off the Statue of Liberty or something.
All right. So, Stephen, first off, what is this bill all about? Is it just kind of a provocative title like we've been seeing with, the legislation and narrative around this issue during election season? Or is it something that's some real substance behind it? And why did Representative Nancy Mace introduce it?
Oh, well, it's definitely designed to get a rise out of people. Absolutely no doubt about that. But there is actual content there too. So at its core, this bill would amend the Immigration and Nationality Act. It lays out new grounds for what they term deportability and inadmissibility, specifically targeting non-citizens who've been convicted of crimes like sexual offences, domestic violence, child abuse, and stalking, and so on. So these are two important legal terms to understand here. So deportability means the authorities are allowed to remove them from the country, and inadmissibility is grounds to actually stop them entering or getting a visa to come to the US in the first place. And so it seeks to make both of those two things much easier for people who've committed these crimes.
Okay. So it sounds like it's kind of making some major changes to the immigration law by cracking down on the violent crimes piece of it.
Yeah.
But don't we kind of already have laws in place for this? What makes this one different?
Yeah, it's funny that, isn't it? Because it's true that crimes like rape and violence and violent crime and so on are already criminal offences, and immigrants who commit crimes are already subject to deportation or are non-admissible. Now, I'm actually going through the immigration process myself at the moment, and so, for example, I need to get a statement from every country I've ever lived in, from the police of that country, stating that I don't have a criminal record to even be considered for immigration into the US. It's very, very strict. And this applies to sort of most areas of immigration as well. And if you have a green card and you commit serious crimes, then that green card can be taken away and you can be removed. So laws already exist like this. So critics like Representative Jerry Nadler would say exactly that, really, that this bill is redundant. And he points out under current law, non-citizens convicted of aggravated felonies, particularly things like rape or sexual abuse of minors, are already deportable. So this bill doesn't really appear to be adding very much. And you may argue that it's more about political posturing, especially in the election season, than it is about actually making laws that might help.
Oh, we love the political posturing. I feel like this is the third episode we've had this year where we've been like, this is an interesting bill because there's already laws that make this not a thing. But we're still talking about it. Okay, so the bill passed the House, so it's clearly gotten some traction. What's the deal? Are Democrats even voting for it, or how does this kind of balance out?
Yes, it did actually pass the House quite comfortably, and 51 Democrats joined Republicans in voting to sort of push it over the line, really. And I think that speaks more to how it's framed than the actual content of it. I mean, particularly in election year, who's going to vote against something called the Violence Against Women Act, especially with all the attention on public safety right now? So we know that women are more likely to vote than men, and that they are this sort of crucial voting bloc that gets people elected. So legislators are very, very wary and mindful not to piss them off. And proponents argue that it does fill gaps in existing law and show a hardline stance against violent crimes, particularly crimes against women and children.
Gotcha. But not everyone's so thrilled. I heard that there's some concern about this, that it could actually impact survivors of domestic violence in immigrant communities. What's that all about?
Yeah, well, we're back to another one of our common themes here, which is rather broad, sweeping, non-nuanced legislation that will often have the opposite effect to the one that it's intended to do. And this is a really good example of where these kind of things can get tricky. So the American Immigration Lawyers Association, AILA, have raised some real red flags around this legislation because they're concerned that this broad language could actually result in deporting survivors of domestic violence themselves rather than the actual perpetrators. Because sometimes in really complicated domestic violence situations, and they usually are very, very complicated, both the survivor and the abuser could get arrested. And the bill
Yeah.
doesn't really distinguish between that. It's just there's a crime of domestic abuse. You've been arrested in connection with that. So you could then end up punishing the people that these laws are actually supposed to protect. Because let's not forget that if you've got a perpetrator of domestic violence an undocumented migrant, well, the victim of that may well be an undocumented migrant as well.
That's a pretty serious unintended consequence. And of course, that's not going to make survivors feel super confident about coming forward in these cases.
That's absolutely true. So critics argue that it will have a chilling effect, making survivors of these kinds of abuse in immigrant communities less likely to report abuse. And we know that the sort of the conviction rates for these kind of crimes are depressingly low anyway. And one of the major reasons for that is that people simply don't report them because they feel nothing's going to happen, or, they have to relive the experience and all that kind of thing. So the last thing you want is a law that's actually going to make it less likely that people would come forward. But also, I mean, another point to note about this particular legislation is that there isn't any waiver in it for people acting in self-defense, which current law does have. So if you actually harm someone in self-defense, again, you could be sort of deported, where it's actually a perfectly reasonable sort of exercise of your rights. So people are saying really that this bill is more about scoring political points than actually solving the problem of domestic violence, or in fact issues or any other issues around immigration.
Yeah, I mean, that's awful. And I think a pretty common thing that we're seeing with a lot of legislation is it's not actually going to help people that we're trying to help and protect women. And we are seeing a lot of that even with the abortion legislation that's coming through. And if a doctor performs an abortion in a lot of states where there is a rape clause, the doctor is forced to report the rape if the person hasn't. So just a lot of kind of unsafe requirements happening. But so what are the odds of this becoming a law? We're talking about the political posturing here. We're talking about, there's definitely some unintended consequences, but is it going to die in the Senate? Do you think we'll take it up, or how is this looking?
Well, honestly, you've got to say it's pretty slim chances that this would ever get through. The House passed it, but the Senate obviously still Democratic controlled, and they're not likely to bring it forward, really. I mean, if you were particularly cynical, you might say, well, all of these posturing bills are being introduced purely because the legislators know that they've got zero chance of becoming law. So maybe if Congress could actually pass some more bills, then they might think twice about introducing legislation that's a little bit slapdash in the way that this one is, really. So it really is more of a messaging bill. It gets people fired up on the campaign trail. But in terms of actual legislation, it's not really going to go the distance.
I'm just reflecting for a second about how much time we've spent talking about bills that are absolutely going nowhere and just meant to stoke. And, we're looking at our government and wondering why nothing happens. And look at you and me talking about all these bills that are going nowhere. And it's like, if we could just come together and try. But
yeah, absolutely. I tell you what, Sarah, why don't we, as we're coming up to the end of the year, why don't we look at some legislation that's actually passed and perhaps even choose our top favorite legislation? So rather than just criticizing all this legislation that's not going anywhere, we can talk about bills that will actually make a difference.
I love that idea. Let's definitely do that. Okay, well, so in that end, we've got a bill that plays into some pretty intense election year rhetoric, might not really move the needle, and it's not really going to help address domestic violence or immigration reform.
No, you summed it up perfectly. It's an election year special for sure. So immigration is a huge issue in the November elections, both for obviously president and down ballot as well. And bills like this really do help frame the debate. But the real issue here, it really needs a more nuanced, thoughtful approach than this bill really does. So whether you love it or hate it, this bill won't solve the problems it's highlighting.
All right. Well, folks, you heard it here. Another bill stirring up plenty of conversation, but it's not really going to deliver anything that it promises, and maybe that's another story. But thanks for tuning in to Beyond the Bill Number. Make sure to subscribe. We'll see you next week for more legislative drama, and don't forget to vote.
And don't forget to send us your thoughts as well. We love hearing your takes on these bills and your comments and so on. So if there's something you'd like us to cover, comments below. Until next time.